The Septuagint stands as one of the most enigmatic and contentious texts in history. Its influence was so profound that it transformed the way scriptures were read, interpreted, and even utilized in the ancient world. But what makes this text so feared and debated to this day? What is there in this translation that makes it a threat? The Septuagint, also known as the LXX, is the oldest Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. Its origins trace back to the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who, in the 3rd century BCE, allegedly commissioned its translation to be included in the Library of Alexandria. According to the letter of Aristeas, 72 Hebrew scholars were chosen for the task, resulting in the so-called translation of the 70. The goal appeared noble: to make sacred texts accessible to the Hellenistic world. However, this translation brought unexpected challenges. Certain passages were altered significantly, leading to deep theological disputes. What began as a mere translation soon became a threat to Jewish tradition and later a vital tool for early Christianity. The name Septuagint emerged centuries later, solidifying the idea that this translation held authority. But how faithful was it to the original? Some argue it was a divine miracle, while others see it as a dangerous distortion of the Word of God. The impact of the Septuagint cannot be underestimated. Many Christian doctrines were grounded in its translations, which, in some cases, differed from the traditional Hebrew text. This sparked intense clashes between Jews and Christians, fueling discussions that continue to this day. If its influence was so vast, why did some religious authorities attempt to erase it from history? What was there in this text that caused so much discomfort? What exactly was changed in this translation? Throughout this video, we'll dive into the differences that made this translation so controversial. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's return to the video. The Septuagint did not emerge all at once. Its development occurred in stages, beginning with the most foundational books of the Jewish faith, the first 5, known as the Torah. These sacred texts, containing the laws and the primordial history of the people of Israel, were translated into Greek in the early 2nd century BCE, possibly within the city of Alexandria itself. Over time, the need to make the remaining scriptures accessible to a wider audience led to the gradual translation of the other books of the Hebrew Bible, a process that extended until the 1st century BCE. Meanwhile, Aramaic translations known as Targums emerged, aimed at adapting the scriptures to the language spoken by most Jews of the time. The Torah had been the first step, but it soon became clear that the rest of the sacred texts also needed to be rendered into Greek, solidifying the Septuagint as an essential tool for preserving and spreading the Jewish tradition in a world where Hebrew was no longer widely understood. The name Septuagint, by which this translation is widely known, has roots in the Latin Septuaginta, interpret, meaning the 70 translators. And then this designation emerged from the account that 70 Hebrew scholars, actually 72, were responsible for the translation. The origin of the name, however, was only firmly established much later. During the early centuries, this version was simply referred to as the Greek translation of the scriptures, without any specific name. It was not until the 6th century CE, with the influence of Saint Augustine of Hippo, that the term Septuagint became popularized and became the definitive name for this translation. The impact of this name transcended a mere reference to the number of translators. It carried an aura of authority and divine inspiration, reinforcing the belief that this work was more than just a linguistic conversion, but a revelation preserved for future generations. The story behind the translation is shrouded in mystery and legend, with the most famous account dating back to the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the Greek pharaoh, who ruled Egypt from 285 to 247 BCE. According to the letter of Aristeas, Ptolemy sought to include the Jewish sacred texts in the Grand Library of Alexandria, considered the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world. To achieve this, he allegedly requested the high priest of Jerusalem to send Hebrew scholars to translate the scriptures into Greek. In response, 72 scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, were dispatched to Egypt to carry out this task. The account, which was later recorded by authors such as Philo of Alexandria, Flavius Josephus, and St. Augustine, describes an idealized working environment where the translators worked in isolation, only to produce identical texts at the end. The perfection of this process served to reinforce the idea that the translation was not just a human achievement, but an act guided by God Himself. The Babylonian Talmud, however, presents a slightly different version of this story, adding an even more surprising element, a supposed miracle that occurred during the translation. In the tractate Megillah, it is recounted that Ptolemy the Sen, without revealing his true intention, locked 72 elders in separate chambers with no communication between them. He then ordered each of them to translate the Torah of Moses without any knowledge of the other's work. When the translations were finally compared, it was discovered that all of them were perfectly identical, with not a single error or discrepancy. For the rabbis who recorded this story, this could not have been a mere coincidence. It was a divine miracle, proof that God had guided each translator to ensure their text remained faithful to the original Hebrew. However, this account also highlights the deep mistrust that many rabbis had toward the Septuagint. The fact that a miracle would have been necessary to ensure the accuracy of the translation suggests that without this divine intervention, the text could have suffered distortions. Yet there is one intriguing question that arises from this narrative: the supposed presence of 6 representatives from each of the 12 tribes of Israel in the translation process. Historically, this raises serious doubts. It is known that about 500 years earlier, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom had been dispersed by the Assyrians, losing their identity and vanishing from historical records. How then could they have sent representatives for the translation of the Septuagint? The answer to this question remains shrouded in uncertainty. Some scholars believe the narrative was embellished to lend more authority to the translation, while others suggest that a remnant of these tribes may have remained in Jerusalem, which would explain their participation in the project. Over time, the Septuagint began to be viewed with suspicion by the rabbis. Many believed that the Greek translation distorted the original text, and as such, it should not be used in synagogues. Rejection grew even stronger when Christians adopted the Septuagint, reinforcing the notion that it favored messianic interpretations. In response, Jewish leaders consolidated the Masoretic text as the official version of the scriptures, gradually excluding the Septuagint from religious use. However, some defended this translation. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher from the 1st century, suggested that parts of Jewish law had already been translated before the Septuagint, and that Plato and Pythagoras might have been influenced by Jewish thought. For him, the Septuagint was more than just a translation. It was a means of connecting Jewish and Greek traditions. The origins of the Septuagint were also questioned. In 1844, the translator Lancelot Charles Lee Brenton rejected the miraculous narrative of Aristeas and suggested that the translation had been submitted to the Jewish Sanhedrin of Alexandria for approval. This would indicate that the creation of the Septuagint was a pragmatic process rather than a divine intervention. Despite the criticisms, its importance was undeniable. The Jews of Alexandria celebrated the translation annually at a festival on the island of Pharos, where the famous lighthouse of Alexandria stood. The event highlighted the impact of the Septuagint on the Jewish diaspora. Beyond its religious significance, the Septuagint influenced writing itself. It contained Hebraisms from both Hebrew and Aramaic, and was crucial for understanding the pronunciation of ancient Hebrew, as the Greek translators had to add vowels to proper names. Thus, the Septuagint not only transformed faith, but also contributed to the study of ancient languages. The differences between the Septuagint and the Hebrew Bible extend beyond mere linguistic matters. The Septuagint is not a singular, uniform translation of the Tanakh, but rather a collection of translations made in different times, places, and by various translators. This process resulted in significant variations between the texts, influenced by the Hebrew manuscripts used at each stage of the translation. Furthermore, the Septuagint preserved texts that were later excluded from the Jewish canon and came to be known as the Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical books. These differences made the Septuagint not just a reflection of the Hebrew text, but an independent work, shaping the view of Scripture in both Jewish and Christian contexts. The structure of these texts also differs considerably. The Hebrew Bible, known as the Tanakh, is divided into three main sections: Torah, Law; Nevi'im, Prophets; and Ketuvim, Writings. The Septuagint, however, adopts a different division, following a model closer to what would later become the Christian canon, separating the books into law, history, poetry, and prophets. In addition, the apocryphal books are integrated within this organization, positioned in a way that makes sense within the overarching narrative of the Scriptures. This reorganization influenced the structure of future Christian Bibles, particularly those used by the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Another significant factor are the variations found in the manuscripts of the Septuagint. Copies dating from the 4th century CE, such as the Sinaitic and Alexandrian codices, present differences compared to the Jewish canon, with books and editions absent from the Hebrew Bible. Moreover, there is no absolute standardization of the content in these copies, leading scholars to question whether the original version of the Septuagint truly included all the deuterocanonical books, or whether these texts were incorporated later as the Christian tradition began to adopt them. The presence of these additional books in the Septuagint was one of the factors that distanced it from the traditional Hebrew canon. The deuterocanonical texts, written between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE, include works such as 1 and 2 Maccabees, Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, Sirach, and the Letter of Jeremiah, as well as additions to Esther and Daniel. Interestingly, some versions of the Septuagint contain longer versions of certain books, while others, such as the Book of Jeremiah, are significantly shorter than their counterparts in the Hebrew Bible. In addition to the deuterocanonical books, some copies of the Septuagint preserve texts that are not part of either the Jewish or traditional Christian canon. Among these are the Psalms of Solomon, 1st Esdras, 3 and 4th Maccabees, the Prayer of Manasseh, and Psalm 151. The existence of these extra texts shows that the Septuagint was not a static work, but rather a body of writings that varied according to the context and community using it, reflecting the diversity of religious thought in the ancient world. The relationship between the Septuagint and Rabbinic Judaism deteriorated over the centuries. Initially useful to the Jews of the diaspora, this translation began to be viewed with suspicion due to its differences from the original Hebrew text. A striking example of this is the Book of Job, which in the Septuagint is significantly shorter. Additionally, the translation posed challenges in interpreting Hebrew expressions. In Isaiah 7:14, the word Alma, young woman, was translated as Parthenos, virgin, a change that directly influenced Christian theology and was rejected by the rabbis. While Rabbinic Judaism rejected the Septuagint, Christianity adopted it as the foundation for the Old Testament. Its acceptance facilitated the spread of the faith among Greek speakers. Catholic and Orthodox churches incorporated its books into the canon, while Protestants during the Reformation chose to follow the Jewish canon, excluding the so-called Apocrypha. Some Bibles, like the King James Version, even included these books separately. Greek culture also influenced the translation. Greek, being more abstract than Hebrew, led to interpretations that softened or modified certain Jewish concepts. Additionally, Hellenistic philosophy shaped how certain themes were expressed in the Septuagint, making them more accessible to the Greek world, but distancing them from the nuances of the original Hebrew. Over time, the Masoretic text became the official version of the scriptures in Judaism. The Masoretes, Jewish scholars of the medieval period, standardized Hebrew pronunciation and reinforced the rejection of the Septuagint, which was considered imprecise. The conflict between Jews and Christians over the Septuagint deepened. For Christians, it was essential, containing messianic prophecies fulfilled by Jesus. For Jews, the translation distorted the original meaning of the scriptures. This dispute helped solidify the differences between the two religions and shaped how each group preserved its sacred texts throughout history. In summary, the controversy surrounding the Septuagint arises primarily from its textual differences, the inclusion of additional books, and its use by Christians in contrast with the dominant Hebrew text in Judaism. These variations have theological and historical implications, especially concerning the interpretation of messianic prophecies and the development of Christian doctrine. If you enjoyed this content and want to continue exploring the hidden mysteries and stories of the Bible, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. This helps us bring you more videos like this and reach more people interested in the Bible. Turn on notifications so you don't miss out on upcoming content, and share this video with friends who might like it. See you next time.